Hi everyone, you're listening to The Party Line, a podcast from The Ditch, news and comment from Ireland on theditch.com. I'm Niamh Ni Bhriain and Harry is still away. He is still in New Jersey with his family, but I am joined today with Eoghan McNeill, who will be talking to about the Ditch stories. And also today we have a pre-recorded interview that Harry did before he left. We'll be hearing from two voices from Palestine. We'll introduce those in a few minutes. But first we'll hear from Eoghan on what's been happening at the Ditch.
Yeah, we've had a story about South Dublin County Council and proposed rent hikes there that are being driven by unelected council management. I think it's important to say that the people who are in favour at this juncture of these proposed rent hikes for about 20,000 households in South Dublin, and in some instances, some of these council tenants could be facing rent increases of more than 50%. Council tenants are also facing 25% increases on their base rates as well. And there are two things that should anger people on the left about it. The first thing is straightforwardly the economic aspect of it, that you are not only forcing these increases on some of the sections of our societies that really shouldn't be expected to pay more during a cost of living crisis, but we're also, the reason for these increases is to bring this council housing under market logic. So, the idea and the principles behind the provision of council housing is that it should happen outside of the market. The thing that has brought us this housing catastrophe, would we call it, but council management are looking to actually apply the rule of the market in this case. And on top of that, councillors themselves were told that these reassessments and reviews would begin next month, and they weren't given an opportunity to even discuss these increases. Councillors, there was a group of 11 councillors. It was a broad coalition of PPP, Sinn Féin, the Soc Dems and some independents. They came together and they said that, base level, we need a consultation with groups like CATU and other activists and people like that, and that there should be a proper discussion in the council chamber about these increases, followed by a vote. And council management, again, the unelected Colm Ward, said no, we're not going to do this. And ultimately it was Councillor Jess Spear, who is with PPP, sent a legal letter to Colm Ward and said, if you don't allow a debate, we're going to see you in the High Court. And a couple of days later, which is often the case with this kind of thing, Colm Ward writes back this big long email saying that, look, I've been advised that we have a strong legal case to fight this, and et cetera, et cetera. Lots of bluster gave out to the councillors for looking to hold this meeting, at a time when council resources are stressed very thin and all the rest. And then ultimately, all bluster aside, he just goes, however, we will allow this meeting because we think it would be a bad look for councillors to be at odds with council management. So they are having a meeting, but the next thing to be angry about is that Colm Ward, in his email where he agreed to this meeting, he said, however, even if you do vote these rent increases down, we're going to go ahead with it anyway.
Regardless.
Yeah, so it's, and Jess Spear, again, she's called it a subversion of democracy, which, we talk about these issues.
And have we any idea of I'm just imagining the people who are in these homes. Did you say it was 20,000 homes or 20,000?
20,000 households.
20,000 households of people. And have they, is there any consultation with them? Is there any recourse for them? or they're simply going to be told, as and of a certain date, your rent is now 50% higher. And if they can't afford it, they're out on the street. That's
what the market dictates.
That's what the market. Yeah. So now we're seeing. So, and maybe just to get the scale of this, and this is just in Dublin South, I understand, or
South
have you
Dublin
seen?
County Council.
Do we know if it's happening in other councils as well?
You know, it was something of a flashpoint. Dublin City Council did similar, but at least in that instance, it was Conor Reddy, again with PPP, managed to bring it to the floor and managed to force a vote on Dublin City Council's equivalent of these rent hikes. Now, unfortunately, we'd have to say that all was happening around the time of the by-elections. And unfortunately, not all the parties of the left voted against those rent increases. Some of the softer left parties voted in favour of those rent increases. Now, the picture looks a little bit different in South Dublin, where you're kind of looking at the councillors who, if a vote were to be held on this, those opposing these rent hikes might indeed have the numbers. And there are some positive signs of the left coming together and a couple of independents as well. But what we have in this instance with Dublin City Council, it wasn't put up to council management, whereas in this instance, these rent hikes could be voted against, but council management are saying
that they'll override that anyways. Yeah. And so we're looking at potentially 20,000 households, people being pushed into homelessness and with no recourse to challenge that. So is there organising around this, or what? Yeah, what can we expect to see in the next weeks and months on this?
Big fight, I think. Some of the party apparatuses, as well as groups like CADU, are obviously opposing these. But, as you said about people possibly being forced into homelessness or not being able to pay, some of the people who are having their rents reviewed are people who are in receipt of an allowance for people who have full-time jobs, but for whom the cost of living crisis has dictated that they can't afford rent. So some of these people, who are as good an example of any that the market doesn't work, are those being affected by it. So it's a fight about rents in South County Dublin, but it's also a fight about, what is housing? Yeah. Who rules us? Is it just the market?
Yeah, and who dictates whether you can have a home or not? Yeah. And on what basis? Is it driven by profit? Is it because housing should be a basic right? I had a conversation over the weekend about what is an affordable home. Like if we there are certain homes that are kind of put out there as these are affordable homes, which is to say, and actually a lot of them are not. But that is to say then that we also have unaffordable homes. This is the terminology that we're using, I suppose.
Yeah. Affordable language really favoured by the state. They love talking about affordable homes. And then that language then, of course, seeps into mainstream analysis of the housing crisis, which, you go back to, it's the real staple of left media theory, George Orwell's Politics and the English Language, how these words just are introduced into a debate and then without any real question of what they actually mean. Sometimes, oftentimes with these words that just seep into mainstream analysis like this, oftentimes really dumb questions are really good things to ask about these things.
Yeah, what is an affordable home? Is that to say that there are unaffordable homes? Yeah, who can afford these homes? And certainly, if you're looking at the scenario in South Dublin, and they're going to, I can't imagine very many people, if their rent were to increase by 50%, they would be able to afford that increase, Yeah. But anyway, so that's our ditch story of the week. We'll move on to our non-ditch story. This one it was in The Guardian, and it was actually a Fintan O'Toole piece.
Love to see an Irish guy doing well over the water.
So we have a Fintan O'Toole piece, and it is a throwback, I suppose, to Brexit, which was 10 years ago. The title of the piece is "The Aftershocks of Brexit's Failure Could Be Gaining Strength, a Fearful Prospect for Ireland." And then Fintan O'Toole kind of lays out his thoughts on, I suppose, the last 10 years. He actually goes back further than 10 years. He goes back to May 2011 when we had the Queen over. And he talks about how this should not have been remarkable, but actually no reigning British monarch had set foot in what is now the Republic for almost exactly a century. And he goes on about how it was exquisitely choreographed exercise in statecraft, and that Ireland and the UK now related to each other as equals. And he says, the ghosts of colonial past were banished, forgetting, of course, that there are 6 counties in Ireland that are still occupied by the British. And he says, the demons of Anglophobia have been banished, but I mean, again, so he goes back, he kind of runs us through this. He says that the moment didn't come out of nowhere, that there was the Northern Ireland peace process, and then there was the European Union. And then he goes on to say that the shock of Brexit for most Irish people wasn't so much about the event itself, but basically this kind of unravelling of how far we'd come with having had the British monarch over and kind of banishing our Anglophobic our past or whatever. I don't know. What are your thoughts on?
There's so many.
So much they could talk about in this.
First thing that I would say, I've got English family who I love, and certainly the royal. I don't take the royal family as representatives of them. I certainly don't. We don't speak a lot about the royal family, but I know that certainly a lot of them wouldn't consider the royal family their representative. So that's the first thing, just to get out of the way. This idea, I mean, I think he said something like that the visit for a lot of people exercised Anglophobia. Mm-hmm. Not me. Exercised demons of our colonial past. As you said, it's a colonial present.
It felt like an exorcism.
Yeah. If you do want to deal with the history and continuation of British colonialism in Ireland, I don't think that bringing Elizabeth II over, have her shake a few hands, even actually on the shaking of the hands thing, she shook hands with Martin McGuinness, and this was rendered in the mainstream as, wasn't this so amazing that she shook hands with Martin McGuinness, given what happened to a member of her family up in Mullaghmore. Now, we could certainly question the utility, the value, the politics of Martin McGuinness shaking her hand like that, but the inverse of that question was never asked about what Martin McGuinness had to overcome in shaking a member of the royal family's hand. It was very much, isn't Elizabeth great for extending that hand of friendship to Martin McGuinness? Right. He was expected to do that, and that he should consider himself lucky that his handshake was accepted, certainly to people like Fintan.
Yeah.
He also goes on in the piece where he gives Keir Starmer his due, and he says something like a word of admiration for Keir Starmer, something not being said in Britain in many circles at the moment. So he does give the little bit of a caveat, but he says something along the lines of about Keir Starmer and what he's done for Irish-British relations. I mean, Sean Brown's family are looking for an inquiry into his assassination back in the mid-90s. Sean Browne, who was a GAA chairperson in Derry, he was abducted outside his Gaelic football club and he was killed. And the British State Coroner's report into his killing says that quite careful with their language. They estimate that there were more than 20 people involved in his death, and that among those were British state agents.
Mm-hmm.
The Browne family are looking for an inquiry into his death, which Starmer's government, Hilary Benn, who Liberals love, are completely resisting and are fighting in court, because they know that were this inquiry to be held, it would completely obliterate any pretense of a separation between loyalist paramilitaries and the British state. Mm-hmm. People like Fintan, though, don't care about that kind of stuff. They just he says it himself. It was exquisitely choreographed statecraft. Yeah. So is that it? Yeah. We just need a bit of statecraft.
We just need it to look nice. The substance of it doesn't actually matter. No, and what he says just on the Keir Starmer piece, at the end of it, he says, in fairness to Keir Starmer, the departing Prime Minister's government has done a great deal to rebuild trust. I mean, just the whole idea that someone like Keir Starmer could rebuild trust. I mean, we've seen how he has been all over the genocide, like he's up to his neck in genocide. That he's been a good thing for Ireland, apparently, to rebuild trust. And the dominant feeling about Brexit in Ireland is, I think, not anger, but sadness. I mean, I actually laughed at that. We're all very sad in Ireland because of Brexit. I mean...
Myself and Harry were speaking about another Fintan O'Toole piece in the New York Review of Books, and it was about Trump and Iran. And over the course of this piece, Fintan did the thing that a lot of people in his position do, where he makes imperialism a partisan issue, right? Where, we had Matt Kennard over the other week there, and Matt has this book called Irregular Army, which is about the US military. And he was asked about the book, and he said that if he had been smart about it, he would do what others do with these kind of books, and he would make it a partisan issue, where you have this array of commentators. You'll have Republican commentators and Democrat commentators who will write vaguely anti-war or maybe even anti-military books, but they will say, and this all happened under Bush, or this all happened under Obama, et cetera, et cetera. Fintan does something similar, where he can be ostensibly anti-imperialist when it comes to a US Republican, but then he'll have Barack Obama over and he'll do a very soft interview with him in the threat arena. He does something similar with the European Union. It's the very idea of Britain leaving this wonderful union of friendly nations just invokes sadness in Fintan O'Toole. And it's never about, I was talking to a few people about it. I was at it was a really great meeting up in Donegal. It was a meeting of the Irish Neutrality League, and they were setting up a Northwest chapter there. And there were representatives from all the left parties, but again, the softer left parties, when they talk about the EU, it's always about reform, and it's all about, the EU may have backed a genocide, but and you kind of want to go, at any point, at any point, are we just going to acknowledge and identify what the EU is, or are we going to be like Fintan O'Toole, and he refers to Nigel Farage.
Yeah, he closes the piece with that, actually.
Because for people like Fintan O'Toole, you can't be anti the EU because admittedly noxious people like Nigel Farage are anti the EU. So Fintan can't seem to consider the EU in any other terms other than, it's sad that Britain is left.
Yeah, and he puts a line in towards the end: if Britain wants to move back into a closer relationship with the EU, Ireland will be there to help in every possible way.
Please God.
There you go. But yeah, so that's Fintan's piece in The Guardian. But probably we should close our Nunditch media section and I will introduce the pre-recorded section, which Harry did a few weeks back. So we have a pre-recorded interview with Leila Warah and Zena Tahhan. They've been telling stories, as journalists do, of struggle and resistance in Jerusalem and across Palestine against all the obstacles presented by a regime of occupation, apartheid and genocide. They've both built extraordinary audiences across the world without always having to succumb to the expectations and biases of Western media. So here's Harry's interview with Zena and Leila.
Zena and Leila, welcome to the Rosa Luxemburg studio. You two are both journalists working in the occupied Palestinian territories. In Ireland, our parliament has been debating a bill to essentially sanction trade with those occupied territories. I wonder, can you talk to us about the occupation and about the legislation and how that fits into the way that occupation is experienced?
So actually, Leila and I were pretty shocked that Ireland is where it's at with these kinds of debates, that there hasn't been more that's been done so far. I mean, outside, when we were in Palestine, we had the sense, and we know that the Irish people are very supportive of Palestine and have been out on the streets pressuring their government. But at the same time, we were shocked that this is where we're at, that this is the bare minimum that should have been done. And this bill was proposed more than 8 years ago. And as we've been saying, the landscape has changed. This is post-genocide. This bill should have been passed a long, long time ago. And now they've also stripped it of the meat of the bill, which is removing the services. And that is 70% of trade with the illegal colonies in the occupied Palestinian territories. So with removing the services, it's just paying lip service to the people and telling them, to the Irish people, and telling them that we're doing something.
Too little, too late, literally, yeah.
100%.
Yeah, Leila, would you agree with that?
I agree, and I think the Irish government, it feels like, is really trying to throw crumbs at the public. To say, hey, look, we're doing something to appease you, while also at the same time kind of piggybacking off of the Irish population's support of Palestine. So like abroad, people are like, oh, Ireland, they're so pro-Palestine, they do all of this work. And so people kind of automatically assume that the government's policies reflect this, when it, in reality, doesn't. And like Zena was saying, we've moved past the point of putting forward little teeny tiny policies that don't make a huge effect on Israel. Post-genocide, post-decades of occupation and the oppression of Palestinian people, what we really need to be pushing for is a sanctions bill, a full sanctions bill on Israel. That is the one thing that would address the issue that's at hand and actually reflect the positions that people are saying and the positions of people on the ground. And instead, we're getting this teeny tiny bill that's throwing crumbs.
And Ireland is the second largest trade partner in the world with Israel.
Yeah.
I mean,
largely through Intel, yeah.
It's well beyond the illegal colonies, well beyond just the little trade that happens with the illegal settlements and colonies. I mean, yes, we are with this step being taken so that it's a stepping stone for other bills, but at the same time, as you said, too little, too late.
And sanctions in general, I mean, there are virtually none in place against Israel, it's fair to say. Do you feel they would make a difference in reality for life in the occupied territories and more broadly for Palestinians?
100%. I mean, the people on the ground, Palestinians on the ground, are defenseless. They need pressure from the outside. And we believe that the only way that Israel will be forced to change its policies and its course of action is through international pressure. And the only reason that we're seeing, for example, Ireland debate this bill is because of the pressure that was on the streets. And even the politicians themselves know this. So there needs to, the pressure from outside is the only thing that's helping the Palestinians on the ground. The pressure from governments, whether pushing for sanctions or an arms embargo or any kind of pressure from outside is the only way that Israel will bow. And the only way it's being maintained is by powers like the US, the UK, the EU. They are the ones keeping Israel continuing to be carrying out these war crimes and crimes against humanity.
And to add on that, what we are seeing is we're in a race. International pressure on Israel has the ability to make a huge change. But we're also facing a climate in occupied Palestine where Palestinians are actively being erased at a very, very fast rate and a very, very fast pace. And so we need the actions on the ground to be reflecting how fast Palestinians are being killed, massacred, arrested, and erased for Israeli settler colonies to be built on top of them. And that's really what people need to keep in mind while they're pushing for these policies, is how much time do we actually have?
So the ever-increasing occupation, in a sense, like the pace of increasing occupation, and that's been a real feature of both of your journalism, I think. So let's talk in more detail about the occupation. There's been a tendency, even when people are discussing the occupied territories bill, to kind of reflect on the destruction in Gaza. You guys work in the West Bank, by and large. You, Zena, in Jerusalem. You're not in Jerusalem, Leila. But can you talk about the effects of the occupation and the kind of reporting that you've done on the expansion of settlements, the attacks by settlers on civilians, etc.?
So before going into the nitty-gritty, I think it's really important to look at the bigger picture, which is what we're looking at is not just occupation, it's settler colonialism. And what's happening in the West Bank is just another stage of settler colonialism. And it's been a long process, and it started with the British kind of partitioning and handing over our land to Zionists. And in 1948, these settler colonies starting on top of the villages of displaced Palestinians, like my family, who were originally from West Jerusalem, from a village called Deraban, where the Israeli settlement of Beit Shemesh was built on top of it. And so Israel already used these same tactics that they're using right now to ethnically cleanse Palestinians, but they've learned from 1948, they've learned from 1967, so that every wave gets harsher and harsher and more systematically effective, essentially.
So I want to say that what's happening in the occupied West Bank is there's de facto annexation happening as we speak. And just for your viewers to understand, when we say annexation, we don't mean that Israel is going to absorb the 3 million Palestinians and give them Israeli passports. That will never happen because Israel has demographically engineered the population to have a Jewish majority in order to keep control, right? So they will never give the 3 million Palestinians Israeli passports because they don't want to affect the demographic balance. What's going to happen or what's happening is that Palestinians are being squeezed into the smallest area possible, smallest land area possible, concentrated into the cities, which are about 18% of the occupied West Bank. The cities, under the Oslo Accords, without going into too much detail, Area A comprises the cities. Area B comprises the villages, and Area C is all the land outside of that, which has all the natural resources, water, land for grazing, farming, etc. All of this, the entirety from the river to the sea is under complete Israeli control. But in the occupied West Bank, they are pushing people from the rural areas and the open areas into the cities through home demolitions, forcible displacement and transfer, settler attacks, military attacks, which go hand in hand, are not two separate things. All of these different policies, residency revocations, countless policies that are squeezing Palestinians, and the Israelis say this very clearly: maximum land, minimum population. Mm-hmm. They're not shying away from it, and particularly since the genocide, they've never been clearer about their intentions.
So the old lie about a land without people is something that they're actually trying to bring about, in especially, as you say, in kind of Area C, in order for annexation to proceed without having to absorb Palestinians as Israeli citizens.
Exactly, and we are not able to naturally develop as a population. We're building upwards in the cities as opposed to expanding, while the settlers are taking more and more land, and it's very important that to understand that in the past, yes, there were sporadic, let's say, settler attacks, killings here and there, every few weeks maybe, or once a month. Now the rates are something we've never seen before. The killings by the settlers and the army, and they have effectively turned into militias of both settlers and soldiers. That there's documentation, video footage of soldiers and settlers shooting side by side, carrying out these attacks together. So this is very much a policy. It's not fringe or extremist settlers. And the fact that the Irish government is sanctioning only two ministers, Ben Gvir and Smotrich, is barely the tip of the iceberg.
It's a state project.
And also just to build on the idea of a de facto annexation, so what does that actually mean? That means that the West Bank, it is annexed. The only thing that's missing is for an Israeli politician to get on stage and say, okay, the West Bank is ours now. But on the ground, nothing will change. Mm-hmm. The settlements are there. They're giant, gated, Israeli-only communities. The Israeli-only roads are there. The military checkpoints are there. The Israeli universities and bus stops and all of these structures for the Israeli settler colony to expand on into the West Bank and take the land are there. And so to give just an idea of how systematic the attacks that Zena was talking about are, these aren't random Palestinian villages being attacked just out of pure hatred. It's very strategic. Mm-hmm. So a lot of the time what will happen is there's an Israeli settlement on a hill. There's another Israeli settlement on the hill across. They want to connect to each other. There will be a Palestinian village in between. Mm. What's the logical thing they need to do? Remove the Palestinian village. And that looks like armed Israeli settlers armed by the state, protected by the Israeli military, invading homes, setting homes on fire, opening fire with their guns on Palestinians, beating them with sticks. And there's also a certain level of the Palestinians in these villages are living in a constant state of anxiety and terror because even when the settlers aren't there, at any moment they can show up. They're living just a stone's throw away. And there's no one to call. It's not like here, someone robs your house. You call the police. You can defend yourself. You can defend your home. No. If a Palestinian tries to defend their child from a settler beating him with a stick, they will be arrested, they will be killed, they will be punished.
You cannot lift a finger, even as you're being attacked.
Yeah. So the hilltop, the valley, and in a sense, all of that being taken away. What are the dynamics of Israeli politics then in relation to any of this? Is there any sense, we had a guest on recently, a historian who's very knowledgeable about the history of the Middle East, suggesting that there are crisis points potentially evolving in Israeli politics, partly about the relationship with the settlers. Of course, there are international dimensions to all this as well. But do you see anything happening within the Israeli political system, the potential for elections and any coalitions of genuine resistance within the Israeli system at the moment? Zena, you know it well.
So I think it's very important to point out to your viewers that since Israel occupied the West Bank and Gaza in 1967, every single Israeli government from day one began building colonies on Palestinian land. They never stopped for a single day, whether that government was left-wing or right-wing or center. All of them had the same policy and all of them supported these policies. Since the Oslo Accords in the 90s, the rate and the number of illegal settlers has more than tripled. That was when there was a peace process, quote-unquote peace process. So the idea that the next government that will come will affect change is the furthest from the truth. Mm. And in fact, like, I'll give you a very small example. When the entire world, during the heart of the Gaza genocide, while it was going very strongly, the entire world was protesting to end the genocide, and Israelis were out in the streets in the hundreds of thousands. There was at one point more than 500,000 people in Tel Aviv, but they weren't protesting anti-genocide. They weren't anti-war protests. These were protests to get the Israelis out of Gaza. So there is a very, very, very small fringe percentage of Israelis who are actually anti-Zionist or anti-war or are standing really with the Palestinians. For the vast majority of them, we are irrelevant to their lives. Their roads bypass our villages so that they don't see us, literally, quite literally. They can go on with their lives without having to pay a price while the Palestinians are suffering. So the idea that there is a small percent, or that there is Israelis who want peace or is a delusion. And if that was really the case, then they would have put pressure on their government. They would have ended the genocide earlier. They would have done a lot more to stop the settlements from growing.
Oh, yeah, we're under no illusions about the state of Israeli politics in terms of their attitude to Palestinians. I guess my question is more about Ilan Pape's recent book is called Israel on the Brink, for example, and he was speaking in Dublin a few months ago, and he said that his wife convinced him not to call it the end of Israel, because that was what that's what he really thinks, is that the end of Israel is in sight, that there's a crisis point that is partly to do with the ongoing Palestinian resistance, but also partly to do with the internal dynamics in Israeli society. You don't see it?
No, I don't think that the quote, as you're saying, end of Israel will come from inside. I think that it will have to be outside pressure. I don't think internal Israeli politics, and there's one very small reason for that. If you watch Israeli politics, any time that there is anything to do with security, like the war on Iran, they all fall in line. There was massive protests, right? As soon as the Iran war started, silence. Anything to do with so-called security and the existence of the state or whatever is precedes everything. And you'll see, I mean, there were massive anti-Netanyahu protests, anti-government protests, right? And he was embroiled in several corruption cases. They wanted him to leave and so on. But as soon as the Iran war started, you can look at the polls, 80% supporting the government.
Right. So post-Netanyahu or otherwise, we're not looking at a likely substantial change in relation to the occupation itself. If anything, the process that you're talking about of an accelerating occupation seems to have its own dynamic.
And it's also whatever government ends up taking the place of the current government, they're not going to undo all of the anti-Palestinian movements that were taken forward. They're not going to undo the settlements. They're not going to change the laws. Essentially, they're not going to undo all of this work from the government that they're currently criticizing. They're just going to build on top of it and use it to their advantage.
Sometimes we, on this podcast, do some journalism shop talk. And I think it's particularly sort of interesting to think about how journalism works for you in a whole variety of ways. For you as relatively young journalists, for you in a changing technology environment where your relationships with large organizations may be different than what would have been in my generation, and also for you, obviously, in dealing with a violent set of occupying forces, both the ones that have the state's uniform on them and the ones that don't but are operating on a state project. Can you talk to me about that, about working as journalists in this setting?
It's definitely an interesting setting to be a journalist. It's not easy. There's a lot of forces both internally working against us and also externally. When you look at mainstream media and how mainstream media twists different stories, that also makes it difficult. And then on top of that, currently with the way that the online information platforms are changing, there's a lot less space for people who want to go in depth, whether that be through long-form documentaries or through written pieces. A lot of people want really quick, easy to understand content. And so all of these things kind of factor together to make it quite difficult to figure out how we can actually get the story out there. But also at the same time, we're in a landscape where we watched journalists in Gaza literally die to get the story out. And the entire world saw what was happening in Gaza. They saw the genocide. The journalists did their job in every form you could think of. And yet Gaza's still being bombed. We're still sitting here living under occupation. So it's also the question of at what point are people actually going to take what we're saying and do something with it?
Yeah. Can journalism make a difference? Does making a difference motivate you, and do you believe in it as does telling stories, telling the truth, does it eventually have an effect?
I mean, we wouldn't be doing our jobs if we didn't think that it would have an effect. But at the same time, it's extremely demotivating how much, as Leila was saying, we talk about, I've been covering Palestine for over a decade. I've been covering the same stories over and over and over again. And then when a media organization like the BBC or the New York Times or even Israeli media like Haaretz say something we've been saying for years, it breaks the internet. It makes you feel, it's extremely dehumanizing, extremely demotivating, and you just feel like you're shouting in the dark. But at the same time, we don't just do our jobs because we feel like it may make a difference. We do our jobs because it's our duty, because it's the least thing we can do is put a camera on them and let them know that they're being watched, that someone is watching what they're doing. And they hate that more than anything. They made public hit lists on journalists in Gaza because they don't want people to see these images. And often, a lot of the times when we're up in the north of the West Bank reporting on Jenin or Tul Karam, these refugee camps that have been completely forcibly displaced, we're the only ones there. There is no foreign media there. We're the only ones with a camera on them. And if we weren't there, you wouldn't be getting these pictures. These pictures wouldn't be coming out. And it's extremely frustrating that so many foreign journalists are pushing and saying that, we weren't able to cover the genocide in Gaza. One, we have more than enough capable journalists in Gaza to cover, and you can see, and it's not even just about journalists. Now it's citizen journalism. Anyone can pick up a phone and film. Two, where are the foreign journalists in the West Bank not covering the de facto annexation, the killings, the erasure of the West Bank that's happening as we speak? If you said, okay, you can't get into Gaza, then why aren't you covering what's happening in the West Bank, at least with some semblance of honesty?
And it's also right now, the news is moving so fast. Journalists can't keep up. One day in the West Bank, you're getting several settler attacks, and then you have to measure them. How bad is the settler attack? Is it newsworthy? Was it just settlers trespassing on Palestinian land? Did they set crops on fire, or did they set a house on fire? Did they shoot in the air, or did they shoot someone? Because when you're getting not just one, but several attacks happening every day, and then on top of that, military raids, dozens of military raids are happening all the time. Palestinians being arrested, Israeli soldiers stopping people at checkpoints every single day, harassing people, searching their phones, beating people, Palestinians being forcibly displaced and feeling like they need to leave or they can't reach a certain place. Every single day, there are dozens and dozens and dozens of stories that are not covered because journalists physically can't keep up with them, and also the people who read them are unfortunately fatigued. Israel is just attacking on every single corner of everything so that people can't keep up and so that they don't know what's happening.
You also have to keep in mind that because it's happening every single day, there's someone killed in the West Bank almost every single day, and most of the time they're children. So the media organization will say, is it one person? Okay, it's not worth a news story. That's how the level has become. But each soul is a story. Each soul is worthy of being covered. It's a person being killed. It's worthy of being covered. But what we'll hear from the media organizations is if it's one person, then it's not worth a story. We can just brush over it. If it's two people, okay.
And it's also you have such a small window to actually cover that story and how in-depth you can go. It's 24 hours and then someone else is killed. So it's okay, that guy who was killed was old news. That kid who was killed is old news. Move on to the next one.
I want to talk a little bit more about reaching audiences. because, you were talking there about news organizations and their resistance and your need to kind of work with their thresholds, with their schedules, with their priorities. But you guys have your own means and your own audiences. What does it mean to be independent and doing journalism without necessarily having to worry about the intercession of a big news organization?
It depends on what format you're working in, but it's been really, with social media, because it's something that's still coming forward, and when you're working independently, you have more freedom to kind of paint the picture and the actual situation on the ground and decide on the stories that you see as valuable of covering. You don't need to depend on editorial rules in terms of the language and in terms of, like, for example, the way that we talk about the West Bank is very much as if it's in the language of two-state solution. The occupied West Bank, occupied Gaza, and then Israel as a state. And kind of further fragmenting the Palestinian state, which I think it's really interesting working either independently or with smaller, more independent news outlets. You have more room to actually explain the context of what's happening rather than just a news story. Someone was killed, but like actually what is the systematic thing at play and how is this all coming together?
Well, we might call the frame. You can kind of set the frame in a way that is different than what those organizations would insist on. And you feel in control of telling that story in that sense as well. Would you agree with that, Zena?
Yeah, definitely. And I think it's up to us to change the language that's been being used for so many years. And as Leila was saying, this international law language that is so unjust to Palestinians, and even the law itself was created by colonial powers for colonial powers, and they are the countries, for example, in the UN. The ones in the Security Council, for example, these are the powers that are maintaining Israel as a settler colonial state and are, through maintaining this, also maintaining the oppression of Palestinians. But at the same time, we are being forced to use this language of two-state delusion, occupied Gaza, occupied West Bank, dividing Palestinians. So when we are able to tell the story ourselves, we are in charge of the narrative, we're in charge of the framing, and it's actually very empowering to push a different kind of framing. And we see that with the new generations of not just journalists, but people on the ground being able to see the difference between mainstream Western media and independent journalists. And just one last point, now there's no need for people to go to, for example, the BBC website. They can follow the journalist that is directly on the ground and see for themselves.
I know, and a lot of people are doing that for sure. And I know that framing that people like you, journalists, independent journalists, do has been very influential, I think particularly with the younger generation. I want to talk about that audience and what it can do, I guess. I mean, I know you're journalists, you're not advocates, but if you were to say to, your viewers, your readers, your admirers out there in audiences all over the world about how they can help and how they can contribute, whether it be through media or through solidarity action or whatever, what would you say?
I would say it's really great and it's really amazing that people are tuning into us and following us and educating themselves. And education is the first step towards moving to something. But what we really, really need to be careful of is falling into this social media chamber where we share a video and we're like, okay, great, I've done my job for the day. I did the thing. We need that education. We need these things that we're learning and seeing online to then actually translate into the real world, into real world action, taking what we're learning and doing something with it.
And I think people in the West and in the EU don't understand how much power they actually have. I think that the work that needs to be done is actually in these capitals, because these are the systems that are funding and maintaining the Israeli state. Much more power than we have back in Palestine, much more. And the policies that need to change need to start from here, from places like Ireland, from the UK, from the US and other Western countries.
The EU, of course.
The EU, 100%. I mean, these people need to understand that what they do here is what will have an impact. What they do on the streets is what will have an impact. And it's not enough just to, as Leila said, post a story. You need to move beyond the social sphere and the online sphere into the ground, on the ground, and direct action. Direct action is what has the most impact. Even just going out in protests is great because you're letting the world know what you think, but at the same time, it's not enough. On the personal level, what products you buy, being aware of where your money is going, all these different levels of whether on the personal level or on the greater level as a group, taking direct action to make it more costly for the occupation to continue, for your governments. And you as people here have a direct responsibility. You're not just helping us because you care about justice in the world. No, your government is complicit. Your government is responsible. And it's your responsibility to stop your government from putting money into these oppressive systems that are massacring people at a mass scale.
And to build on that, a lot of these things that we want and that will help us in Palestine and support us in Palestine are also the same things that are holding people in Ireland back. Why are they having so much trouble passing this teeny tiny bill? Because of an American stronghold on the economy here. From a British occupation to an American hostage situation of the economy. And so pressure being put on that is going to help, yes, the support in Palestine and the situation there, but also life here for the Irish people who are seeing living situations get harder and harder, more and more expensive, housing situations decline. All of these issues are intertwined. To fight for a better world is not to pick one cause here, one cause there, but they're all the same fight, and remembering that is really, really important.
Okay, so there is one last thing that I wanted to mention that I think the Irish people will really resonate with because their experience and our experience in this issue is very much intertwined. And actually, Palestinians really learned from the Irish experience in resisting the British occupation. And some of those resistance methods were transported from Ireland to Palestine. And I'm specifically talking about political prisoners, the hunger strikers, the different methods of resistance that came out in the British prisons in Ireland. A lot of those methods were transported to Palestine. So I feel that people here really resonate when we talk about this issue. There are more than 10,000 Palestinians being held in Israeli occupation prisons, over 20 prisons across the country. The issue of the political prisoners has always been horrific, but what we're seeing after the genocide is nothing we've seen before in terms of the level of violence, the number of killings of prisoners, through torture, through severe beatings, like beating people to death, starvation. There was a 17-year-old child who starved to death within 6 months of his arrest. He was completely healthy. You can see pictures of him before. More than half of those 10,000 are people who are held without trial or charge. And that being said, those people who are charged for political reasons and nothing else. They are not criminals. They are not robbers or whatever. No, this is purely political. And it's important to remind also that in the West Bank, we have a military court system. So the judge is a soldier and the guard is a soldier. Everyone in those courts is a soldier. And they have a 99% conviction rate. It's extremely important for people to know that the prisoners are suffering very, very badly. More than 100 prisoners have been killed since the genocide through the ways that I mentioned. And as you know, some of them have been even raped to death. So all of the Israelis are outside of Gaza now. They all went back to their families, whereas there are 40 to 50 at least every single day Palestinians being abducted in the middle of the night from their homes. And just to explain that this is policy. There is a policy in the Israeli military that says making your presence felt. And that means terrorizing the population every day with mass arrests, beatings, humiliation, everything you can think of. And you can see so many videos of Israeli soldiers online abusing people. It's not a secret anymore. So this is just to say that we feel that the prisoners are being forgotten, and it's actually one of the most important issues to talk about.
Thanks, Zena. Zena Tahhan, Leila Warah, thanks for coming in.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you for having us.
And with that, I think we'll finish the podcast. Okay, thank you, Eoghan. Take care. Bye.